For the purpose of this interview, please state your name and the branch of military you were in.
My name is Matthew Belson, and I served in the U.S. Coast Guard Reserve.
How did you end up on Cape Cod?
So started coming to the Cape in 1997 and spending summers and time here with my now wife, and she and I were living in New York City, and in 2004 we moved from Brooklyn, New York to Cape Cod.
How did you end up in the military?
I joined the Coast Guard Reserve a year after 9/11 happened. I'm a native New Yorker and was working in Lower Manhattan when the attacks on the World Trade Center occurred, and I wanted to do something and serve my country and join the Coast Guard Reserve a year to the day after the attacks. I was sworn into the Coast Guard Reserve on September 11th, 2002.
How did your parents react to you joining the military?
My mother was very supportive and happy that I did so.
How did you feel when you got deployed for the first time?
So, when I joined the Coast Guard, I was assigned to the Public Affairs Detachment in New York City. And being in the reserves, typically you serve 1 week in a month and 2 weeks a year. But then in times of crisis, natural disasters, national security, etc., you can get called up. It's called being mobilized. And so the first time I was mobilized was in the spring of 2003 in New York City. That's because someone in my unit was deployed over to the Persian Gulf and Iraq for the start of Operation Iraqi Freedom. So he deployed, and then I was called up to fill his position with my unit. And then when he returned, I was then called up and deployed to Iraq in the Persian Gulf from December of 2003 until June of 2004.
What made you go into... Oh, wait, never mind. Describe the scariest moment during your service.
So the thing about the Coast Guard is it's a multi-mission service, which means that it's always doing something. It's not just focused on wars and national defense. It's one of its missions, but other missions are search and rescue, environmental protection, maritime law enforcement, drug interdiction, all these interesting missions that the Coast Guard has. So throughout my time in the service, there's been several times when it's been very potentially dangerous situations, be it on a boat in rough seas or flying in a helicopter, but certainly the experience of when it was a very high threat environment was when I was deployed over to the Persian Gulf in Iraq and going on boardings of vessels and then being on the ground in Iraq in convoys and walking street patrols with coalition forces. So there were definitely times when the threat of violence was very acute.
Describe a typical day in the military.
Well, I think a typical day in the military, it really depends what branch of service that you're in, but also what your job is. My job in the Coast Guard, I was a public affairs specialist, which basically means I help tell the Coast Guard story. So, from excuse me. So, anytime I could be, on a boat capturing photos or videos of search and rescue operations, I could be writing a press release about rescue and sending it to the media, and then fielding questions from the media, so serving as a spokesperson for the Coast Guard. It could be, running a press conference or doing a feature story. So even when I wasn't overseas in the Coast Guard, when I was stationed here in either New York City or out of Boston, any day could be different. I could be up in Maine, I could be at an air station, I could be in the office doing paperwork. It really depends on the job and the day-to-day that you're supposed to do.
When you were over in Iraq, what did you typically eat for like a meal?
So it depends. So I was based out of an Arab country called Bahrain. It was one of the Gulf Coast countries, and the reason I was based there is because the U.S. Navy has a large base out of Bahrain. So that's and that's where also the Coast Guard unit was based out of. It's called Coast Guard Patrol Forces Southwest Asia. And so when I was over there, the Coast Guard had several cutters, patrol boats, patrolling Iraqi territorial waters, protecting oil terminals. There were Coast Guard law enforcement teams on Navy boats. There were advisors on the ground in Iraq, helping to train Iraqi forces. And so in Bahrain, there was a huge support presence for the Coast Guard, so to help maintain all the Coast Guard boats. And so while I was based in Bahrain, there, it's a country, so I could, when I wasn't deployed, I would, I could go have a pizza or an Italian meal or a shish kebab sandwich. But then when I was on a Coast Guard cutter or a Navy ship, you're eating in the galley. So, and the food, especially on Coast Guard cutters, was very good. So you could have, chili or, steak or, eggs. It was fine. But then there were times when I was in Iraq, when, I'd have to eat MREs, which are these rations that the military eats. They're in a pouch and they come with a little heating unit and, beef enchiladas and and a little thing of Skittles, which was always nice to have. So it really depends.
What called you to go into the Coast Guard besides the 9/11 part?
So I like the thing about the Coast Guard is it's always doing its mission, meaning it's not, some of the other services which are always training and preparing for war, so to speak. The Coast Guard, because it's multi-mission, every day it's always working to do something. And also the Coast Guard is based within the communities of the country. So, here on Cape Cod, you have, small boat Coast Guard stations. You have an air station. You have, they're smaller, and being in the community, you get to work every day. So it's, and the other thing about the Coast Guard is that I enjoyed was the job. So as professionally, I'm a journalist and my background is journalism. So being able to apply those skills as a public affairs specialist in the Coast Guard was very cool.
Describe your happiest moment in the service.
My happiest moment in the service. There were a lot. I will say that I had the pleasure and the privilege of serving with some of the finest men and women of all ages that I've ever met. Just, the camaraderie and the sense of purpose and everyone working together to get a mission done was very satisfying.
Was there ever a time when you were in service that you almost regretted going into it? Or like there was something that was happening that made you want to not be there?
No, I joined the Coast Guard kind of late, older. I was, I think, 31 when it happened. The military is like anything. You have good days, you have frustrating days, and you have bad days. But overall, the experience was tremendously positive, and I still say that my biggest regret would have been never joining the Coast Guard Reserve and having the experiences that I did.
What does friendship mean within the military?
Friendship, camaraderie. So in the Coast Guard, you always refer to the people that you're with as your shipmate, and that is something that's taken very seriously. It means you look out for each other, and the person always has your back, and you work together. You have to work together. There's to get the mission done, and I think that's and especially when you're in a small unit, and I think that's the thing that's a little different from the Coast Guard. Of all the services, it's the smallest of the service, and it almost seems like someone knows someone, especially with my rate, the public affairs specialist rate. There's not too many of us in the Coast Guard, so everyone kind of knows everyone. But when you're on a boat or you're on a cutter or a small boat station, you have a group of people that are spending a lot of time together, and you just become very close, and you become like a family.
What was your... Oh, wait, no, I don't want to ask that one. What were the places that you went like? Like the weather and the people and the atmosphere?
So the places that I went to in the Coast Guard were pretty varied. Were varied. So when I was, let's start. So I was in New York City, one of the largest cities in the world, and so you're dealing with New England weather, like in Boston, so summers and cold winters, and I remember going on cutters on the Hudson River for ice-breaking operations. I had to deploy down to the Gulf of Mexico for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, which was in 2010, and being on the Gulf of Mexico in July, it was very hot, very humid. And then when I was in the Middle East, the Persian Gulf is, that's hot, 120 in the shade. It's a dry heat, and there's dust everywhere. It's just being in a dust storm, the smells, the sights. It's varied.
Describe your most thrilling experience in the military.
My most thrilling experience in the Coast Guard. Again, I had more than I can count. I would say that some of the more exhilarating experiences I had. I loved flying in helicopters. That was fun. And going in a helicopter and shooting photos and videos out the door was always fun. Being in small boats was always exhilarating, especially surf training, crashing through the surf. And and then also what we would call working a case, meaning, when there was something that happened and there was a high amount of media interest, be it, an oil spill or a search and rescue case where everything is happening very fast and you have to get a lot of information and then you're conveying it to the public and the media and you're talking about it. It was very, very exciting.
Is there a specific moment from your service, whether it be happy or sad, that has always stuck with you since you left the service?
Again, there are many, but I think one of the clearly touched on the camaraderie and, shipmates all around you. But I think one of the things that is hard for a lot of people to comprehend is being on a Coast Guard cutter for an extended period of time. Living aboard a ship, especially a military vessel, is unlike anything else. Just sort of the rhythms that throughout the 24-hour period of people working and the sounds and the smells of a boat at sea. It's quite unlike anything that your average person gets to experience.
Are there people that you were friends with in the service? Do you still talk to them today?
Yes, absolutely. Shipmates for life is one of the sayings. It's, you can't have such intense experiences with people and not want to continue those friendships afterwards.
If you could go back to before you enlisted, what would you do everything again? What would you enlist in? Would it be the Coast Guard again or a different branch?
I would still go back, and if I could go back in time, the only thing I would do differently is I would have joined the Coast Guard sooner and put in a full 20 years.
Describe the struggles you faced adjusting to civilian life upon your return.
So I think one of the differences between the reserves and full-time active duty is in the reserves you're a civilian for most of the time, and then 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year you put on a uniform and you have to change your mindset and quickly reintegrate into military customs and courtesies and the way of doing things. So adjusting back to being a civilian was not a big deal for me. I will say the periods where there was an adjustment, though, was when I came back from the Persian Gulf, because I was gone for almost 7 months, and that took a while to get back, just because you're so used to doing things one way, and then suddenly you're not doing it that way anymore. And then when I went down to the Gulf of Mexico for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. That was for 2 months. That was probably the toughest of all deployments, because I got the call and said I had to leave within 48 hours to get down there. And at the time, what was different is my kids were very small, so having to leave very quickly, and suddenly my wife was, the sole caretaker of 2 kids, and she has a full-time job. That was very difficult. And then coming back, it was, not as long as when I first went overseas, but coming back, it's, leaving 2 small kids for 2 months, and your family for 2 months was tough. But that pales into comparison with, other members of the military who deploy for, over a year, sometimes longer, and have to leave their families for much longer periods of time than I did.
What was the most drastic difference between being like civilian life, the way you did it like that way, and the way you did it in the military?
So I think the two, there's a lot of takeaways from my time in the service, but I think one of the biggest difference between the service, the military, and civilian life, and I think it has to do more in terms of professionalism, is accountability. Meaning, in the military, there's something called a chain of command. You have, there's someone above you, there's someone below you, and at the end of the day, the mission has to get done, and the goal is to do that. And part of that is, I was fortunate when I was in the Coast Guard to have tremendous supervisors, and one of the things that I still apply now in whatever capacity professionally is, one of my supervisors once told me that his job was to make sure that I was trained, and my training was such that at some point I could take their job. And so this idea of mentoring and encouraging the people to do the best that they can so that they can be promoted and get the job done, it's just part of the culture of the military. And I think that's something which you don't see it as frequently in the civilian world, where the idea of people supporting each other and wanting that other people's success is also your success, and at the end of the day, it's about getting something done. And that's something that you don't really see that much.
What was the highest rank you ever reached in the Coast Guard?
An E6, so I was a petty officer, first class.
If a relative of yours was going into the military, what advice would you give them?
Do your homework. Meaning, it's, when I say do your homework, do your research. I mean, I met with recruiters and I talked to them and really looked at what I wanted out of the military, and then also, what your goals are. If it's, some people, the reason people join the military are as varied and personal as there are numbers of people who join the military. It could be for patriotism. It could be for college GI Bill, so you could get money for college or grad school. It could be just to get a job. It could be for adventure and excitement and travel. I mean, it could be a combination of all those things. I mean, it always varies. So I think, just it's one of those things. Ask a lot of questions, and but then also try and be in as good a shape as you can before joining, because regardless of the service, you do go to boot camp, and it's physically and mentally demanding.
What is your view on war after your time serving?
What is my view on war after my time serving? There's it's a cliche, but the greatest proponents of peace and non-conflict typically have been people who have served in the military and experienced war, and it's not good. I mean, the places that I've been, particularly, in the Middle East and Iraq and Yemen and all these other places, you see seeing firsthand the destruction and the devastation that war can bring is, it's something that you hope no one ever experiences, particularly the people that you care about. And I think that's another takeaway is by seeing the suffering and the devastation that other people experience, it does make you appreciate what you have at home, and also want to help make sure, hope that people can recognize that our problems can really be solved at home just through talking and community. But yeah, as far as opinions and perspective on war, it's not pleasant. It's horrible.
How did it feel to return home and not be in the service any longer?
So two different things. So like when I returned home the first time, I still had several years after of staying in the service. But coming home in June of 2004, that was from serving overseas, was great. I mean, it was your classic. I had a homecoming party and friends and family, and it felt very good to be home.
Describe how your life has changed since being in the service and going to Iraq and stuff.
Well, I think my experience in the Coast Guard, the skills, I mean, I acquired tremendous skills. Even though I went into the Coast Guard already a working journalist, the skills that I learned while serving in the Coast Guard have been very useful. Both skills as for marketing, for public affairs, for photography, video, all these technical skills. But it's also the experience that I've had in the Coast Guard, just how to do things, how to plan things, how to look at things. I still carry with me today, but also how to treat people. The concept of shipmates, of loyalty, of friendship, of focusing on getting something done, are things that I still retain.
Why did you agree to do this interview?
Two things. One, I think it's in our country, despite unfortunately the many years that we've been fighting in one conflict or another, the majority of Americans, I think, have a disconnect between people who serve in the military or veterans, and if you've never served in the military, and you don't have any friends or family who have served in the military, and through no fault, it's something, if you haven't experienced it, it's not something that you automatically have a great understanding about. So I think, talking an interview like this and talking about, my experiences, perhaps can help gain a better understanding of, what it means to serve, and that the experiences that veterans have are as unique to them as there are numbers of veterans. And the second reason why I'm doing this interview is because my wife told me that I had to do it to help out with the project. So.
Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Okay.